Hello from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson. In 1998, the Modern Library published a list of what it termed the 100 best novels of the 20th century. Its first and third positions were each works by voluntary exile, Irish expatriate writer James Joyce, the runner-up within this win, place, or show sequence being F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, with also-ran contenders consisting of such works as Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita at number 4, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley in the 5th position, followed by William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury at number 6, and Joseph Heller's Catch-22 rounding out the top 7. The book which brought Mr. Joyce into the literary winning circle was the 783-page-long Cubist stream of consciousness novel Ulysses, written during the protracted 4-year carnage of the First World War and its immediate aftermath between 1914 and 1921. This massive work, as extensively analyzed by Stuart Gilbert in his 1930 book titled James Joyce's Ulysses, was conceived as a reflective modernist retelling of the Odyssey of Homer set in a single day, June 16th, 1904, incorporating multiple points of view and taking place within and around the Irish capital city of Dublin. Instead of 10 years following a great war like the Homeric epic sequel to the Iliad, Ulysses takes place 10 years before the First World War, and then compresses the wanderings of Odysseus from the coast of Asia Minor to the Straits of Gibraltar, before his eventual return to his faithful wife Penelope and home island kingdom of Ithaca, down to a bit less than 10 square miles, providing a microcosm of the human experience within a time-bending, multiple perspective rendering of the actions and interior monologues of well over 100 residents of James Joyce's physically abandoned but never forgotten home city. Born at 41 Brighton Square in a suburb of Dublin called Rothgar on February the 2nd, 1882, Groundhog Day, a midway point between the winter solstice and the spring equinox, James Augustine Joyce was the second but first surviving child of John Stanislaus Joyce and his 10-year younger wife, May, a son named George, having died shortly after his birth. May, good Catholic wife to her frequently intoxicated husband, would eventually become the mother of 10 surviving children before her death from liver cancer at the age of 45 in 1904. As the eldest male child, James, like his 2-year younger brother Stanislav, received a Jesuit Catholic education beginning at Congrove's Wood College at the age of, as young Jim termed it upon enrollment, 6:30. And then, when the Joyce family's inherited fortunes began to dwindle, in conjunction with his father's chronic drinking and subsequent loss of employment, the two brothers continued their educations tuition-free at Belvedere College, where James learned French, Italian, and Latin, while also exploring the streets of Dublin and by his early adolescence, its brothels, leading him at a fairly young age to require treatment for venereal disease, as well as into conflict with his religious upbringing, and ultimately causing him to reject the church in favor of a secular and far more sensually based personal worldview. While continuing his studies as a student at Dublin's University College, according to authorized biographer Herbert Gorman, James Joyce developed aesthetic principles derived from Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, based upon the concepts of intergas, integrity, and claritas, clarity. As with Catholicism, Joyce rejected the folkloric concepts of the Celtic Twilight Irish culture revival advocated by William Butler Yeats and his patron Lady Augusta Gregory, referring to it as the Celtic Toilet, and instead being drawn to the realism of Heinrich Ibsen, even teaching himself Norwegian in order to undertake correspondence with the Scandinavian playwright. In 1900, while still a student, Joyce published an article titled Ibsen's New Drama, and on one occasion, during a literary salon, read his own poetry to W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory, who, apparently unaware of his opinion regarding the traditional Irish culture of fairies, leprechauns, and banshees, became avid supporters of the young writer. 2 years later, when Joyce left Ireland for Paris, acting upon a sentiment that he would later describe in a portrait of the artist as a young man, asserting, "I will not serve that in which I no longer believe, whether it call itself my home, my fatherland, or my church." It was Lady Gregory who helped him get work as a book reviewer for the Daily Express newspaper while planning to study medicine. His time in France, however, was cut short by the news that his mother had been dying and the need for him to return home, where his commitment to interrogas would cause him to decline his mother's final request that he pray at her bedside. Following the passing away of May Joyce, her son James remained in Dublin, briefly moving into a decommissioned Napoleon-era watchtower with a medical student friend named Oliver Gority. Then, on a crowded Dublin street in June of 1904, Joyce met a chambermaid from Galway named Nora Barnacle. Following an initial broken date on June the 16th, they apparently, in one fashion or another, consummated their relationship, and just 4 months later, on October 20th, 22-year-old James and 20-year-old Nora left Ireland together for Zurich, Switzerland, and what Joyce thought would be a job teaching English at a Berlitz language school. Arriving to not find the job, the couple then went to Trieste, where Joyce was given work, although briefly being incarcerated upon arrival with a group of drunken British sailors for whom he'd tried to serve as an interpreter with the police. In 1905, Joyce and Nora became the parents of a son named Giorgio, after the writer's deceased brother George, according to Brenda Maddox in her biography of Nora, and also, according to Maddox, after Joyce had once proposed marriage to one of his students from a wealthy Jewish family. In 1907, a daughter was born in a pauper's ward, who the as yet unmarried James and Nora called Lucia. This birth was subsequently followed by what either was a miscarriage or perhaps an abortion, and then the Joyces had no additional children. It was also in 1907, after contracting rheumatic fever which affected his vision, that James Joyce published a volume of poetry titled Chamber Music, gaining no royalties from this slim volume of verse, but attracting the attention of modernist, make-it-new American expatriate poet and editor Ezra Pound. 2 years later, as dramatized in the motion picture Nora, featuring Ewan McGregor and Susan Lynch, based upon the Brenda Maddox book, Nora, the real life of Molly Bloom, Joyce briefly returned to Ireland in a failed effort to establish that nation's first motion picture theater, while also signing a contract for the printing of a collection of short stories to be titled Dubliners that had previously been rejected by as many as 18 different publishers over a period of 9 years. Among the 15 pieces contained within this collection was an amazing story called The Dead, in which a writer, Gabriel Conroy, who had, like Joyce himself, turned his back on Ireland in favor of the European continent, discovers an unexpected depth of feeling related to his wife Greta and her previous relationship with a young man from Galway, Nora's hometown, named Michael Fury, who had died from pneumonia after coming to see Greta before she'd planned to leave for Dublin, producing a truly stunning reverie that ends the narrative. Yes, the newspapers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. It was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly on the bog of Allen and further westward, softly falling into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling, too, upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead. Ultimately, however, the printer judged the work overall to be improper, allegedly due to its use of real place names and recognizable persons. So, to avoid potential libel suits, the copies were destroyed, although later being reprinted by an English publisher and finally released on the 15th of June in 1914. 13 days after that, however, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie on a street in Sarajevo, essentially eclipsing promotion for Joyce's collection of short stories and beginning the events which would lead to the First World War, subsequently causing Joyce and his family to move from the Austrian port city of Trieste and relocate to Zurich in neutral Switzerland, while his brother Stanislav, who the author persuaded to join him in Nora, largely to help with expenses, was imprisoned by the Austrian authorities for the duration of the war as a suspicious alien. By this time, James Joyce had also written an autobiographical novel he called Stephen Hero, the manuscript of which, in an apparent fit of frustration, he once threw into a fire Nora retrieved, thereby making it possible for him to revise the text, calling it A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. When this work began to be serialized within a publication called The Egoist, edited by Ezra Pound, who had not yet met James Joyce in person, the work's closing section proclaiming, "I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncharted consciousness of my race." Its author had already begun on Ulysses, sections of which Pound helped start to appear in 1917 within the Little Review, eventually causing that publication's owners, Margaret Anderson and Gene Heap, to be prosecuted for distributing obscenity in a case that wasn't resolved until 1933, when a United States District Court of New York determined that the work was not inherently obscene. While living in Zurich with Nora and their 2 children, in 1917, Joyce produced a theatrical run of Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, as related by Tom Stoppard in his 1974 play Travesties, during a time when communist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin and Dadaist Tristan Tzar had been living in that city. The following year, after having been rejected by W.B. Yeats for the Abbey Theater, Joyce had performed in Munich his only play, Exiles. But then this was not produced again until 1970, when Harold Pinter directed the show in London. Within it, an unmarried couple returns to Ireland from self-imposed exile in Rome with their infant son, described by his father as being a child of sin and shame following the death of the man's mother. There are sexual intrigues, central characters' former lover and her first cousin, current sexual partner, as well as man's intentions to seduce the mother of the illegitimate boy, and questions of nationality, free love, and individual autonomy. Also, at about this time, an heiress named Harriet Shaw Weaver took over the magazine, which had first included excerpts from A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and decided to publish the entire book. She also began to anonymously provide financial support to Joyce and his family when the writer had begun to develop glaucoma, eventually requiring him to undergo as many as a dozen surgical procedures on his eyes. In 1920, 7 years after having become aware of the writer, Ezra Pound encouraged Joyce to move his family to Paris, and it was there, in 1922, that the owner of Shakespeare and Company bookstore, Sylvia Beach, after crashing a party to which she had not been invited in order to meet Joyce, agreed to publish the book in full, releasing the first 2 printed copies of Ulysses on its author's 40th Groundhog Day, February 2nd, 2222 birthday. Having been written between 1914 and 1921 for 10 to 12 hours a day, almost every day, Joyce once explained, "My book is a creature that for years has been in the womb of my imagination." Also, on another occasion, he observed, "Imagination is memory." In fact, it was from the whole of the author's remembered life experience and other writing that Ulysses was conceived. compressed into the events of the single day, June 16, 1904, the date of Joyce's first date with Nora Barnacle. Each of Ulysses' 18 episodes are presented in a different style, as well as representing a different organ of the body, color, art, place, and time of day. The novel begins at the Tower, where the hero from A Portrait of the Artist, Stephen Dedalus, had been staying with stately, plump Buck Mulligan, essentially Joyce and his wealthy frenemy, Oliver Gordy. Like in the opening section of Homer's Odyssey, this beginning focuses upon a young man who feels dispossessed in his homeland, much like Joyce after his return from Paris and the death of his mother. The narrative then follows Stephen Dedalus from his morning musing on top of the Martello Tower overlooking the snot-green sea, the scrotum-tightening sea, and being visited by a vision of his deceased mother into his day, teaching school, getting his pay from an aging anti-Semitic headmaster who'd written an article about hoof and mouth disease that he had wanted help in having published. This is largely a parody of a letter Joyce had obtained for the Evening Telegraph in 1912, as Richard Ellman pointed out in 1954, half a century after the date on which the novel is set, in an article titled The Backgrounds of Ulysses. Then, Stephen Dedalus ventures out along Dublin Bay, where his stream of consciousness ranges from the objects in his immediate environment, that rusty boot, to an imagined telephone connection extending back through his navel to the Garden of Eden. After that, once again, like the Odyssey of Homer, and in good Cubist fashion, the narrative shifts, not to a rocky coast along the Aegean Sea, but back to the early morning in the home of Leopold and Molly Bloom at number 7 Eccles Street, which, as Brenda Maddox points out in Nora, was the address of a friend who'd once assured Joyce of the fidelity of his children's mother when it had been called into question by a man named Vincent Cosgrove, who'd known Nora before Joyce, and who apparently accidentally drowned in the River Thames in London when he was 46 years old in 1926. Here, the day of June 16, 1904, begins anew, with secular Jewish ad canvasser Leopold Bloom serving his wife Molly breakfast in bed before venturing out into the streets of Dublin in an epic wandering that would eventually bring him, after attending a friend's funeral, to encounters with a large number of Dubliners, many of whom had appeared within the collection of short stories by that name. Confrontation with a one-eyed Irish patriot, an escape by side cart, the masturbation scene that got the book banned and its American magazine publishers jailed, a visit to a maternity hospital, a hallucination-filled late-night bacchanal in a whorehouse, and then, penultimately, into the company of Stephen Dedalus before returning to lay head to foot in bed with his wife Molly, where she had hosted her lover earlier in the day, Blazes Boylan, the worst man in Dublin, before Molly then concludes the narrative with an extended and largely unpunctuated 45-page, 3-sentence monologue chronicling her lived experience reaching back from Bloom's arrival in bed with her when she had been a girl, where her father had been stationed in the British military on Gibraltar, and then as a woman with over 25 previous lovers, commencing with his wife Nora's actual first boyfriend and including Stephen Dedalus' father, a pair of Catholic priests, the Lord Mayor of Dublin, and an unknown bootblack from outside the Gaiety Theatre, as well as Blazes Boyland, finally recalling the moment when she had gotten Leopold to propose to her, thinking at the time, well, him as another, and concluding, in spite of the physical estrangement which had developed between them following the death of their infant son, Rudy, with an affirmation of the life that they had lived together and her resolute resolve in response to his marriage proposal to say, yes, I will. Yes. A year after the publication of Ulysses, and for the next 17 years, Joyce undertook what he termed a work in progress that would eventually be published in 1938 under the title Finnegan's Wake. Plural, not possessive. This book, however, served to alienate both Ezra Pound and Harriet Shaw Weaver. Yet, it's been described as being the most innovative work in the history of world literature. Now, if Ulysses had in any way been influenced by the point of view shifting concept of Cubism, Finnegan's Wake is clearly surrealism, pretty much as defined by André Breton's manifesto as being pure psychic automatism. Finnegan's Wake is a dream experienced by its main character, the owner of a pub on the outskirts of Dublin, who, along with his wife and 3 children, Shen, Sean, and Izzy, transform into hundreds of other characters, our hero becoming Humphrey Chipton Earwecker, HCE for short, or Here Comes Everybody, pressing towards a universal tale of fall from paradise and redemption. The Wake is also, as a former university colleague of mine once described it, a history of the multifaceted events which clutter all human lives and eras. Famously, starting with a fragment of a sentence, the beginning of which ends the book, creating a perpetual cycle of renewal and return, Finnegan's Wake offers what is essentially a history of the human mind from outside of time, in a mix of comedy and tragedy, offering, as mythologist Joseph Campbell observed in A Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake, in the midst of the tug and pull of chaos and order, like Ulysses, a resonant reaffirmation of life. Within James Joyce's own life, however, even with recognition as being the greatest writer of his generation, personal challenges continued. Following failed relationships with Joyce's secretary, Samuel Beckett, and then sculptor Alexander Calder, the author's daughter, Lucia, promising dancer who'd studied with the brother of Isadora Duncan, was diagnosed with schizophrenia, receiving treatment in Switzerland from Carl Jung, and ultimately being confined to an insane asylum in England, where her mother never visited, and, in the final decades of her life, only Samuel Beckett occasionally came to see her. Joyce's son Giorgio, like his grandfather and father before him, who often drank white wine to the point of unconsciousness and had to be carried home by Ernest Hemingway, became increasingly alcoholic, and then James Joyce himself died after surgery for a perforated ulcer on January 13th in 1941 at the age of 58. His wife Nora dying of kidney failure some 7 years later. What James Joyce left behind, however, is a legacy as the 20th century's greatest creative writer and a body of work which, as he had predicted, would ensure his immortality and keep the professors busy for centuries. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.